Hi, my name is Niki. This is The Interventionalist, and I really want to talk about the different ways that misogyny can manifest in lesbian relationships, and also just how disorienting and confusing it can be to experience hatred, like misogynistic hatred from another woman as a woman. And yesterday, I made a video talking about the way that misogyny has really heavily defined the concepts of insanity and madness and the diagnoses for these things through the constructs of womanhood. And on that video, I got a comment that I ended up deleting but it says, I just want to know, why do lesbians talk about men and misogyny so much? Just be happy being a lesbian. You don't have to worry about men no more. Talk about how happy you are with girls. Which, okay, fair. Like, I am really happy with girls. I love women. And I'm very thankful to have experienced the relationships that I have. And I'm thankful that I get to be a lesbian, honestly. However, just because I am a lesbian doesn't mean that I escape the influences of misogyny in my relationships. I mean, we don't escape it in general. If you live in a misogynistic culture, you can't escape it at all. It's embedded in the fabrics of your society or your systems and your socialization. However, I also don't escape it just because I'm in a relationship with another woman, or just because I'm in a lesbian relationship. And this is an idea, though, that I have thought about quite a bit, actually. The video I made yesterday was about kind of the concepts of misogyny and madness and insanity, but it was inspired by something I made 2 years ago, the first video I ever made on here, which was about the concepts of misogyny-induced insanity. And it was a little bit different, like the original way that I went about this, and it was about the way that experiencing misogyny in my lesbian relationship made me feel insane. And it made me feel insane for various different reasons, but particularly because I didn't expect it, and I didn't really think that it was possible. So while this person is commenting this, saying, just be happy, like, why are you thinking about misogyny in men and stuff? Because they continue to influence my relationships. However, I used to kind of think the same thing, like, oh, I'm not going to have to think about, like, misogyny isn't going to impact my lesbian relationships because it's a lesbian relationship. And it's kind of a naive idea, right? But before I had gotten into a relationship and with another woman who ended up being, like, really deeply misogynistic, which I'll talk about, I just sort of naively thought that that couldn't occur in a lesbian relationship. And actually, the first thing I ever wrote for my website was about this. And here's a little part from it that kind of sums up, like, what I'm talking about. I assumed that I would escape misogyny at the hands of a partner, maybe not all, but at least the particular parts I found. A lesbian naivety. It is natural to expect a sense of solidarity, of understanding when you are with someone who has suffered the same socialization which aims to diminish you. A society that has made the experience of womanhood synonymous with inferiority. To find resentment in the place of empathy is incomprehensible. And the last part right there is kind of what I want to talk about, which is the way that it felt incomprehensible. Like, to experience misogyny, at least in the way that I did in a lesbian relationship, didn't make any sense to me. Like, it actually felt so disorienting and confusing, and it really shook my... This sounds dramatic, but I think if you've experienced this, you'll understand. It really shook my, like, worldview and my view of relationships and my safety in relationships, or, like, my assumed safety, I suppose, around other women. It really just, like, shook my brain. And I was already, like, my brain was already, like, all fucked up from the abuse itself, which was heavily influenced by the misogyny. But that, it just, like, was this added layer on top where my perception now of relationships in general was all, like, scrambled and confusing and scary. And there's something uniquely painful and confusing about experiencing the misogyny and violence that you've only ever seen from or expected to experience from men at the hands of another woman, or the person that you assume will empathize with you instead. For her to then perpetuate these, like, really harmful, scary, misogynistic narratives and ideas and dynamics is just really a mind fuck, and also relies heavily on gaslighting and abuse in order to function, because that's kind of what I want to talk about, which is the way that misogynistic dynamics can exist within lesbian relationships. And I'm not talking about, like, heteronormativity. While we, like, use those words to describe kind of more than anything, just like this, we have a masculine and, like, a feminine presence in the relationship, like that kind of idea. When we use the word heteronormative, I'm talking about misogyny, which is the use or like the power imbalance that exists between two individuals, and in misogyny between like a man and a woman. And it's not necessarily about heteronormativity, it's about the power imbalances that existed within the relationship and how that can exist uniquely within lesbian relationships, where that power imbalance likely doesn't naturally exist. Like for me, I'm a woman in a relationship with another woman. That power imbalance on a systemic level, on a structural systemic level, doesn't exist. Like she does not have power over me that way, nor do I have that power over her. However, she was heavily misogynistic. She hated women, and she wanted a very traditional heteronormative relationship, but rooted in misogyny, as in that traditional heteronormative relationship. That dynamic had to be rooted in the fact that she had more power over me. Not just because we were two people who enjoyed this, I guess, sort of dynamic of having a more masculine presence and a more feminine in whatever way that means. She wanted power, and she wanted there to be a power imbalance, and she wanted the power of oppression. And I'm sure that there's so many reasons why. I mean, I could probably pathologize her until the fucking cows come home. And I know when I've talked about this with people, they always have a lot of different theories, and there's probably a lot of merit to the ones that people come up with related to gender and sexuality and socialization and trauma. But at the end of the day, all that I know is that she hated women, and she was a woman, and she identified as a woman, and she wanted there to be the dynamics that I have only ever seen in oppressive, misogynistic, straight relationships. And while I'll never know the exact reasons that she hated women to the extent that she did, and she hated me and my womanhood to the extent that she did, I know that the projections then of that hatred and that misogyny looked pretty similar to any like very, I don't know, oppressive, misogynistic, heterosexual relationship. And the roots were different. Like, I don't know exactly why. There's probably a million different reasons that added up to make her hate women the way that she did. But she likely only hated women because she is a woman who's been hated by men for being a woman. And I think that led to a lot of projecting onto me as a way to sort of escape that oppression or that hatred by becoming the oppressor rather than being the oppressed. So recreating sort of the dynamic that she experiences as a woman with me, and putting herself in a position where in this recreation, she's the one in power. And she would need to be with another woman in order to do that, to project her original experience, I think, of feeling oppressed onto somebody else. And that's probably just one aspect, right? I don't know. I think that there's probably a lot that led to this, because she also really hated a lot of things about my experience of womanhood that was really confusing for me. For example, I remember one time she just started talking about how gross and disgusting it is that women have periods. And I was like, just listening to her, and then I just said, well, don't you have one? And she said, well, it's different. And I just remember thinking, okay. Just things like that. Like, she hated a lot of these, I don't know, she hated a lot of these like core aspects of my womanhood, and I know things that she was experiencing, and it was really confusing to have somebody who was supposed to understand that experience, and who did understand that experience, like the experience of the oppression that comes with being a woman, and also having these other experiences like having a period and menstruation, and then perpetuating the idea that it's gross or dirty and weird, but it's only weird that I'm experiencing it, not her, because she's different. So it was very confusing to be in a situation where I was with someone who I know was experiencing the same misogynistic impacts as I was, because of these aspects of our experiences, because of our aspects of our womanhood, and hate me for it while she was experiencing it, was incredibly confusing to me. Like, I didn't know how to wrap my head around that, and I would try to just, I guess, sort of tell myself that this is how relationships are supposed to be anyways. Like, they're supposed to be a sort of like oppressor and the oppressed, like within relationships, because that's how I understood relationships. That's what I was raised with, these like ideas of traditional heterosexual, heteronormative relationships. And so I don't know, it didn't really make a difference whether or not I wanted to argue with her or try and get out. Like at that point in that relationship, there was no way I was going to be able to just like get up and leave. It would be really unsafe. So while I was stuck there and in that relationship, I tried to rationalize like what was happening, and part of that rationalization came with me sort of convincing myself that these sort of dynamics were normal, which was one person being like feminine and being sort of hated for it, while the other is masculine and in power and hates you for it, for being feminine. And that sounds, I know, like sounds crazy, unless you've experienced something like that. But I don't know, that was what was happening. And despite the fact we were both women, like I was still experiencing the misogyny that I think you really only expect, or rhetoric you really only hear from really hateful, misogynistic men. And I know that I'm not the only lesbian who's experienced this, like being in a relationship where there's like these sort of insane recreations of what you only have seen in straight relationships, or through like really misogynistic relationships and relationship practices. I know I'm not the only one who's experienced that, and the way that it can sort of like make you feel like you're losing your mind. And I think it's the reason that I was thinking so much about insanity whenever I think about any of this is because of the way that it made me feel like I was losing my mind. And one of the reasons that I think experiencing misogyny in a lesbian or queer relationship can make you feel like you're losing your mind is because, at least in my case, right, like she's trying to recreate these really misogynistic power imbalances and structures and dynamics. But we don't have a power imbalance. We don't actually have a power imbalance, not in the way that she wants, right? Like that she's trying to recreate, because we're two women. So it relies on her artificially constructing it. And in order to do that, she has to create emotionally and mentally a power imbalance, or at least make me believe that there is a power imbalance. And that requires emotional and sometimes physical, at least in my case, it was a very abusive relationship, efforts to do this, like gaslighting and emotional abuse and manipulation, in order to convince the other person that they are lesser than the other, in the way that the systems, like misogynistic systems, are like have already socialized you to believe that you are when you're in a straight relationship. And she was a very abusive person in many different ways, but something that I think in particular that made me feel so crazy is that so much of her mental abuse relied on convincing me that I was lesser than her. And there's so many different reasons that she would do this, right? There's so many different ways you could talk about this experience, like somebody beating you down to believe that you're lesser than them. This is what abusive people do. They do it to make you believe that you need them, that you can't survive without them, that you'll never find anyone if you lose them, that all of these different ways that they'll try and beat you down in order to gain control over you. And that's the same thing that like misogynistic systems do. They like beat women down on a systemic level so that they feel reliant on men. And that's what she was, in relation to misogyny, that's what she's doing. She's trying to beat me down to make me feel reliant on her, that I need her and that I'm below her and I need to rely on her, and that she should have more power over me because I'm lesser than her, and therefore like it wouldn't make sense for me to have like an equal say in the relationship, or to have equal, or to receive equally in the relationship in all these different ways. And so when you're in a lesbian relationship then, and there is this effort being made by somebody who really wants to recreate this like misogynistic power dynamic for whatever reason they do, they have to make an active effort every single day in that interpersonal relationship to create that dynamic and to create that belief system, to like really instate that ideology, that misogynistic ideology, like to create a system within your personal relationship that mimics a misogynistic one in order to keep that power and that control. And that means abuse, that means gaslighting, that means emotional manipulation, that means making somebody feel like they're kind of losing their mind as they're being groomed into believing something that doesn't exist, such as like this inherent power imbalance simply because you're a woman, because you're in a relationship with another woman. So that power imbalance doesn't exist, but you're being gaslit into believing because you're a woman, you should have less power and you should be worth less, and that you aren't worth as much and that you don't deserve as much, and all these different things. You're being gaslit to believe that that is the reason that you are lesser than, because you are a woman. but it's at the hands of another woman. And that's really confusing. And even if it wasn't like in that moment I could like say out loud or verbalize the way that it was making me feel like I was losing my mind to be with another woman who was trying to force me to be below her in the way that men have only ever forced me to be, or like men have only ever done, I guess would be the word. Maybe I wouldn't have been able to verbalize why that was part of the reason I felt like I was losing my mind, but when I look back now, I know it is, because even 2 years ago, I was thinking about it all the time, the way that like my perception of the world and relationships and women and my expectations from women and my understanding of women was like heavily shaken. And I do think that there was an aspect of naivety to that. Like we all have a certain amount of naivety before we get into relationships and we experience things, right? Like that's just, there's nothing wrong with being naive. And so yes, I was a little bit naive, and I just didn't anticipate these kind of power imbalances or power structures or these like misogynistic ideas existing within a lesbian relationship, especially being hated for my womanhood or being told that I should be less than in the relationship because I'm a girl and because I'm a woman and because I'm the feminine one. Part of the reason was I wasn't feminine enough and she hated it. But that I was like all these ways in which I was supposed to be lesser than because I was the weird, like feminine one. Weird feminine one. I don't know if that's the right word, but it's kind of like going back to the way that she wanted me to be more feminine. She didn't like that I had a period, all this stuff like that. Because of my experience as a woman in particular, she thought that I should be lesser than. And it like justified me being like perceived as weirder or like dirty or gross or lesser than because I was experiencing just like my experience, my personal experience as a woman, right? And when I look back now, I know that that was part of the reason that I was probably starting to lose my mind in that relationship, because it was causing me to like it started to distort my version of reality that I had always lived in, the misogynistic reality that I had always known and lived in, the one that I understood, the one that I had studied in college when I was studying political science and sociology and philosophy, like my worldview, my understanding of the world and the way that it has always been, which is when you think about misogyny, you think this is a man, he's going to oppress a woman, here's a system, he's going to uplift the man and oppress the woman. And suddenly I was in a relationship and that dynamic was being instated or actively trying to be instated for the same reasons. Like my oppression was going to be upheld for the same reasons, and it was because I was a woman, but at the hands of someone who should also be oppressed as well. And I'm supposed to believe then that I am still lesser than this person for being a woman, despite this other person being a woman. And that's really confusing. And I was stuck in that relationship because I couldn't get away for safety reasons. Eventually I did, and I was really lucky, and I had to move states. I had to change my phone number. I had to like completely change my life, but that followed me. And the way that I perceived relationships after that was really confusing, and my fear of relationships grew like tenfold. Not only did I then have intimacy issues because I was in an abusive relationship, but now I had this fear of relationships in a different way than I ever had, which was being afraid that I was going to have somebody like treat me the way that a man has only ever treated me, in the scary ways that a man has only ever treated me. And that naivety was lost, where I assumed that I would escape that like I guess in quotes, like scary man treatment, right? I thought I would escape that. I learned I wasn't going to escape that could exist in lesbian relationships. And so now whatever relationship issues I already had and I was going to have because of the abusive aspect of the relationship, well, the abusive relationship in general, there was now this like knowing and this understanding of misogyny and the way that it can influence lesbian relationships and other women that I could be in a relationship with, and how dangerous and scary that can be. And suddenly relationships seemed a lot scarier for a lot of different reasons. And I felt like I was losing my mind because I just never thought that this would be something that I would experience in a lesbian relationship. And the constant gaslighting in order to make it a reality alone was enough to make me feel like I was losing my mind. Another aspect of the way that this can make you feel like you're losing your mind, like the misogyny in a lesbian relationship that's trying to recreate like a straight relationship in that oppressive way, is the way that it relies on each individual then recreating those like traditional oppressor and oppressed in like identities. And in my case, that meant because she was really masculine, I needed to be really feminine. She needed to be hyper masculine and I needed to be hyper feminine. And I'm not a really feminine person. But I'm not hyper feminine. That was like a huge issue in our relationship because I was never feminine enough. And every single day it was like a problem. It was like every day, like trying to gaslight me into believing that I was more feminine and I just needed to get in touch with it more. Like that I was domestic and I just didn't realize it before, and that over time I would learn that I actually really like being domestic if I just forced myself to do like domestic labor for her. She would just constantly every day like sort of berate any aspect of me that she thought wasn't feminine enough, while at the same time trying to convince me that I actually was indeed very, very feminine, while acknowledging that I wasn't feminine enough, which is really confusing, which is why it made me feel like I was going insane, because she's telling me I'm not feminine enough, but then telling me that she's with me because I'm a really feminine girl and she wants really, like, all this stuff. It's really confusing, right? It doesn't make any sense. It made me feel like I was losing my mind. And I'm not that feminine. I'm not feminine in the way that she wanted me to be feminine, not in like the traditional stereotypical way that she wanted me to be feminine. So to have somebody telling me that I was this, or that I liked these like very stereotypical, almost trad wife things, like behaviors, this identity, while I'm not, was really confusing. Like somebody consistently, I've talked about this on my TikTok before, and I'll make a video about this eventually, but about the way that abusive people will like build an identity for you and ascribe an identity to you as a way to control you. And one of the ways that she did that for me was telling me that I was a really feminine, sort of trad wife person. That was my identity, and that I actually really enjoyed being like this very like traditional sort of like stay-at-home wife kind of energy. It was just very bizarre, and I wasn't any of those things. And so suddenly like being told that I like these things, being like, oh yeah, but you love doing that, like you love cleaning for me. I mean, I just don't. Like, you love cooking for me. Like, you love that. I mean, you're really domestic. You love being domestic. You just didn't realize it before me. Is like the kind of stuff that she would say. While in the same breath, say that I'm not feminine enough and she wishes I was more feminine. But then saying that I'm like the most like hyper feminine traditional idea of femininity, and that's why she likes me, and I just didn't realize I wasn't these things before her. It's very confusing. But if you've experienced that, like sort of gaslighting, the sort of double identity that this person is giving you, which is ascribing an identity to you and holding onto it and projecting it onto you as a way to control you and build you into, hopefully, the person that they want you to be. Also acknowledging that you are not yet the person that they want you to be, and then shaming that as a way to hopefully encourage you to become what they want you to be. So it's a very double-edged sword, and it's a really fucked up maneuver, and it really messes with your head. And sometimes it's hard to like really like navigate when you're in that situation. It's easy, I think, from the outside for people to think like, okay, well, that's stupid. Why are you even listening to her then? Like, obviously none of this makes sense, all this stuff. But when you're in that situation and someone is sort of running circles in your brain that way, and if you already are in an abusive situation or you struggle with like a sense of self, like I really did, it's hard not to just like sort of believe when someone is telling you who you are, when you like struggle with knowing who you are or believing in who you are. And so that played a role as well, right? Like all these other things that made me vulnerable to this relationship and to her. But that was one of the ways she utilized it, that like vulnerability, which was weaponizing the ascription of an identity to me. And that was to be a really feminine sort of trad wife person, woman, and also acknowledging that I wasn't. And that's how she continued to create this sort of misogynistic dynamic, this misogynistic power imbalance, was by ascribing me the identity that would be necessary in order for her to have that relationship as the really masculine one. And that's really fucking confusing, because now my identity was being defined for me. And that just relied on a lot of grooming and gaslighting and manipulation. And so I felt like I was losing my mind, because what if I did like these things? I've talked about this in a video before. I don't remember what video it is. I reference it briefly, but how in that relationship, I started to think that I liked things that I didn't, or I was trying to convince myself that I did because I didn't like them. And I would like tell my friends, I'd be like, no, I actually think I'm really domestic. I think I'm really domestic and I just didn't realize it before. Like, I think I'm actually really domestic and I really like it. Like, what does that even mean? You only understand, like, to be like, I'm really domestic is pretty misogynistic thing to think anyways, right? And I remember my friends would be like, oh, that's really, like, are you sure? That's really not like you. And they would try and sort of bring me back down into reality or remind me of who I was. But I was like, no, like, I swear, like, I think I just didn't realize it before. And then when it ended, and I was finally out of it, I was like, I hated that shit. That's not who I am. I'm not this like super traditional, hyper feminine individual. I don't enjoy these things. There's nothing wrong with enjoying these things. The problem is that I was being told that I did, and I was being forced into positions where I essentially needed to inhabit that identity or I'd be in danger. And when I was out of it and I was safe, it's like I didn't like any of that shit, actually. And even if I did, I wouldn't have even have had the opportunity to figure out if I really liked it, because I was in an abusive situation. So nothing I was doing at that point was really of my own volition anyways. But I don't like that shit. I don't like it. I never have. I never did. I don't like it now. I didn't like it before. It's just not my personality. But when I was in it, I was like, no, maybe I do. Like, I really do. I like had really started to convince myself, or try to convince myself of a reality that I had never lived in, that I had never wanted, and that didn't feel right to me, in order to sort of like figure out how to live in or navigate the reality that she was imposing upon me. So essentially it like caused me to try and like warp the reality I had always had into her reality that she wanted, and like warp the two together to make it work, which meant trying to gaslight myself into being like, no, maybe I actually was always this way and I just didn't realize it, so that I could mesh those two realities together and make it work, and not, I guess, feel like I was losing my mind when I was in a position that I couldn't even get out of. So that's how you try and cope. You try and like cope by making it make sense to you. And the way that I did that was trying to gaslight, like self-gaslight myself into believing that these things that she was telling me, or like at times forcing me to do or to be, were things I actually liked or I wanted to be or who I actually was. But I wasn't any of these things. But the point is that this lesbian relationship, this woman who wanted to recreate these power imbalances, these systemic power imbalances, there weren't these power imbalances. She had to rely on emotional and physical manipulation and gaslighting. And that's how the constructs of oppression and misogyny within the relationship were artificially constructed. And I'm sure there's a million reasons why she was artificially constructing that. I mean, probably so much internalized homophobia, internalized misogyny, just general self-hatred, probably manifestations of trauma. Like, I'm sure the active effort to try and recreate a power imbalance in a relationship is heavily influenced by somebody's feelings of unsafety in relationships in general, and so needing to feel like they have power and control in order to avoid being vulnerable. I'm sure that played a really big role. I'm sure that she probably had trauma and that led to her being afraid of vulnerability in some way or another, that led her wanting to be the one who would have the power to inflict harm upon the vulnerable rather than be the vulnerable. I'm sure there's all these different ways that all these different things that influence the way that she behaved in that relationship, or what led to her behaving that way in that relationship. But at the end of the day, like, the impact it had on me was I felt like I was losing my goddamn mind. I felt like I lost my mind, and I lost my sense of self and my identity. And there's so many different ways that relationship affected me and my sense of self-worth and my sense of identity. But one of the ways is my perception of self in regards to my womanhood, particularly in the way that I see myself as a woman and the way that I then saw relationships, romantic relationships with other women. And suddenly, what something I used to see in maybe a bit of a naive light that was going to avoid the impact of misogyny, like my relationships, for example, was being seen through a misogynistic lens. And my perception of myself was now very, very heavily being filtered through a misogynistic lens. And I was thinking about myself in ways that like were very hateful and very misogynistic for quite a long time after that relationship, in ways that I hadn't really ever thought about myself. But if like you go in a textbook and probably look at the ways that misogyny affects women's sense of self and their experience and their identity, I was suddenly experiencing that on a very like textbook level. And then in addition to that, suddenly feeling a lot less safe to pursue relationships with women, because I was afraid that this would happen again. And, you know, this can happen. Every relationship can have its issues, but this was just a particular issue that I just didn't expect would come up. And knowing that it could now come up, and the extent to what happened and what it did, and it made me very afraid of relationships for many different reasons. But one of the reasons was the realization that misogynistic dynamics, very hateful, oppressive, scary misogynistic dynamics, can exist within lesbian relationships. And it can be so frustrating, I think, as queer people to have experiences like this, to have just negative experiences in general, like any other person in the world when having relationships, and to be impacted by things like misogyny, and then tell your story or your experience and essentially have that used against you. Kind of like the comment I referenced in the beginning of this video, being like, I don't get why lesbians talk about this so much. Like, just be happy, move on. As if being a lesbian negates the experience of misogyny or the influence of misogyny. And so suddenly I can't talk about these things without being like, I don't know, annoying. Or I've had like other comments before, I wish I'd screenshotted them, but about how like essentially like saying how women are actually always the problem then, because our stuff, like, I'm trying to think like exactly what it said, but there was one recently that was like, this is proof that it's actually women are the problem and not men, because look at what happens when there's two lesbians or when there's two women in a relationship. Things like that, of that sentiment, where essentially having any experience of, I don't know, having any difficult experience in a lesbian relationship is somehow proof that women are the problem and it's not men. And also that being gay is wrong and not right, because if it was right, then there wouldn't be issues in it. Like, I've had a lot of these kind of comments, like, over time, like between my Instagram and my TikTok and here, I've gotten those in varying degrees. And so it's just frustrating, because just because anyone is not straight doesn't mean they'll not experience the influences of misogyny, and that themselves and their partner won't be influenced by misogyny. And also, just because we experience things in relationships that aren't always positive, just like any other person in the world, that is not proof or evidence of anything other than we are just humans experiencing a relationship, let alone evidence or proof that somehow all women are the problem in relationships, because that's such a silly, that is a naive and silly thing to say. And it's just frustrating that so many queer people, I've talked about this before also, but we don't get to talk about our negative experiences in relationships without it being weaponized against us, when everyone in a relationship will likely have negative experiences. And so much of our negative experiences can be influenced by the socialized structures that we're influenced by, like misogyny. Even if we're not in a stereotypical, like, heterosexual relationship where we, like, tend to see misogyny the most, or we see those, like, very, I don't know, sort of very clear pillars that, like, hold up misogyny. It's like a relationship between a man and a woman, right? Just because a relationship doesn't look like that doesn't mean it can't experience those issues. And queer people should be given a space to talk about the very unique experience that they have regarding things like misogyny in their relationships without having it weaponized against them. And I don't know, that's like why I wanted to talk about this, because I have felt insane for a long time after that experience, and my perception of relationships and relationships with women was really distorted, and I was really afraid for a long time. And I think now I would like to think that I have sort of like come to understand what had happened, or maybe feel a little bit more sane when I think about it. But in all actuality, like, it's still something that makes me feel a little bit crazy when I remember that, and I remember that relationship, but particularly the very misogynistic aspects of it that I mentioned, like the hatred that she imposed and the hatred that she spewed, and like the sort of ideologies and the gaslighting, like, related to my identity and stuff like that. And it's something that I don't know if I'll ever really feel sane about when I think about it. It always makes me feel a little bit crazy, and it's hard for me to think about, particularly because I'll make a video about talking about this one day too, but there's so much that I can sort of psychoanalyze about the situation and empathize and find ways to try and empathize with her and why she might have been doing the terrible things that she was. And when I think about things like this and the ins and outs of this relationship and why maybe she was perpetuating such misogyny, it leads me to have to think about what led her to those things. And then I can try and paint a picture to empathize with her. And I think that's why I don't think about this experience in particular as much. One, because it still always makes me feel a little bit insane, but also because I think about it then on a system level, and the way that she's definitely been impacted by misogyny, by being socialized in a misogynistic system, and how that likely led her to treating me the way that she did. But that means inherently empathizing with her. And that is like a dangerous path to go down. I think if you have experienced abuse, you've been in an abusive relationship, is opening a door to understand why the person who has abused you might have abused you, because it's easy then to sort of make yourself believe that you you don't have the right to be affected by it, because you understand that they may have behaved in this way because they were affected by something prior. And that's what I struggle with, which is why sometimes I this in particular aspect of the relationship I'll struggle with talking about, because I'll be like, well, I can look at the system influence and why this probably really affected her and what might have happened that led to this. And then I'm like, so I should be more empathetic and more understanding. But then it's like, oh my God, I can't go down that path because that relationship was horrific and she's a very disturbed individual. Yeah, that's like a really, that's like actually not relevant at all. That's like a really big side note, but okay, I guess whatever. Maybe I'll make a video talking about that one day, like that feeling of wanting to almost excuse somebody's cruelty towards you because you might understand where it's coming from or what led them to behave in a cruel manner, potentially. Okay, I just really got off topic. Okay, maybe that's it. Maybe this is all that I have to say. And okay, yeah. I really went off topic. I'll end it here. But I just really wanted to talk about the concept of misogyny in lesbian relationships, because it does exist and it does happen, and sometimes it looks a lot like what we see it look like in textbooks talking about misogynistic practices in straight relationships. We're not immune to it, and it's a very unique experience with a very particular impact on your psyche because of it, and the way that it manifests and that it has to manifest are the way things that have to happen in order for it to manifest in any capacity are often very abusive and scary situations to be in, like manipulative, emotionally, physically abusive, a lot of gaslighting. Those are the sort of behaviors that usually need to take place in order to artificially construct the dynamics that we see naturally in a misogynistic system. And I don't know if you've experienced that, if you've experienced somebody ascribing an identity to you in order to role play something else that you're not consenting to, or to try and create a power imbalance, or you've experienced misogyny, misogynistic practices at the hands of somebody that it just doesn't make sense to you that this is happening, or you never anticipated it from. Just know that you're not alone in that, and you're not crazy if you're feeling like you're experiencing something that you thought only would ever happen in like really stereotypical, misogynistic, traditional heterosexual relationships. And it's not something that you should feel like you have to hide or you can't talk about, because it affects us, and it's a big deal to feel like your mind's being messed with and sort of mutilated that way. Your perceptions of reality and relationships and your perceptions of yourself all rooted in misogynistic practices and ideologies and belief systems, all of the ways that might be impacting you and affecting you through the conduit of a gay relationship. You shouldn't have to feel like you're not allowed to talk about it, and it does make you feel crazy. And if you're feeling crazy, just know that you're not alone. And yeah, but that feeling crazy doesn't last forever. I know I said I still don't always feel sane when I think about it, but I definitely don't feel crazy every day the way that I once did. And I can talk about this stuff now and this experience without sort of immediately spiraling into losing my mind. While it still makes me lose my mind a little bit, it's not nearly as bad. And I think with time, when people really fuck with your head and your perception of yourself and your like role in relationships and who you are in relationships and what's expected from you and your worth in relationships, and applying like misogynistic constructs to like a lesbian relationship, I don't know. It can make you feel crazy, but that craziness, it really won't last forever. That like impact on your perception of the world. And yeah, I guess that's it. But you're not alone if you do feel crazy, or you feel like you're spiraling into a state of insanity. It's still something I worry about sometimes. But you're not alone if you are experiencing that, and if you've experienced misogyny in a lesbian relationship. And that is not proof that it is a bad thing to be gay, or that being gay is a bad thing, or that all women are the problem, for example, that you're not supposed to talk about it. And anyone who tries to make you believe that now it's like stupid to talk about it if you are a lesbian and you're experiencing misogyny, you shouldn't, like, why are you talking about it, kind of like that comment I got, that's dumb. Or if someone tries to use like a poor experience you had as evidence for their homophobia, that's also fucking stupid, and they can fuck off. So yeah, if you wanna talk about it, if you have an experience related to this or something related to this really at all, and if you want a space to talk about it, please feel free to leave it in the comments. Like, if there's just an experience you had with this that you wanted to share and you need a reason to talk about it, please feel free to leave it down below. And I promise no, like, annoying ass people like the comment I got who said shit like that will bother you, because they'll get deleted and blocked immediately. So if you want to have a space to share that or talk about it, you have a safe space here to do that. And I also have a website with a submissions page, and you can submit something through there if you want to talk about something like this, or just have anything you want to talk about, like something that's heavy on your heart that you want to get off your mind, or just literally any kind of thought on anything ever. I have a submissions page on my website, and you can send something through there as a reason to talk about it, and I can publish it to my site, and I publish people's work, and there's been some really wonderful pieces that went up recently. I would recommend reading them. They'll be linked down below. They're really beautiful pieces, especially related to being queer. I highly recommend them. But if you have something you want to say and you maybe want others to see it, I can put it on the website anonymously or not, or it can just be between us, and I'd be happy to hear it. I'd be honored to read it. And yeah, I write things on my website as well. I'm actually going to I'll link down below the piece that I wrote originally that like talked about this a couple years ago. It's called "Can a Woman Hate Me Like a Man?" I'll link that down below if anyone's interested in reading that. And my first video I ever made talking about this, my first video ever, was actually about this topic. It's called like Misogyny Induced Insanity. It's like my first video on this page if you're interested in watching that. I actually did it with a friend at the time. And yeah, I guess that's kind of it. I have like a TikTok and an Instagram if you want to look at those. And yeah, I think that's all I have to say. Okay, that's it. Well, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.